Genealogy. We shall talk about an ancient people here, as ancient as the eternal forest. It has ancestors of all ages and all nations, for it is not a tribe of the body, but of the soul, not of the inhabitants of a forest, but of its lovers, of the true worshippers of the wood. Of this family came the poet of Hellas, who sang the myths of Pan and his satyrs, and Baldur in Scandinavia, and that spiritual relative of theirs, who gave the Kupala night to the Slavs. Later, this family found a patron among the followers of the new religion, because he had their soul and their lineage, a lover and singer of the sun, a preacher to birds and fish, a friend of all God's little creatures, the seraphic Saint Francis. Thus, these folk can be seen to have sages and scholars and saints among their ancestors. And although they may at times seem to have been swallowed up by the general mass of humanity, yet they have retained a certain distinctive quality of their forest soul. Yes, they have been snowed under by earthly upheavals, by the feverish pursuits of ordinary life, by complications and conditions, and by the very struggle for material existence. All of these removed them from nature. 1, civilization. 2, the so-called progress. 3, the destruction of nature through the expansion of industry. 4, the terrible burden of modern existence. 5, modern rights and obligations. Seemingly, then, there is no place and no life for these forest folk. But it only seems so because they have adapted the best they could to their conditions and make an effort to appear no different from others. They fulfill their daily duties, they work hard with and among others. They participate in civilization, they take part in progress. They use its inventions, know how to handle money, live in cities, dress like others, go to the theater. Has the lineage and tradition of the forest people perished, then? Not in the world. Immortal is the spirit, and the lineage of the spirit is immortal. It's just that he who would know this tribe must stem from it. Then he will find his kind. One need not look for this tribe in quiet villages or deep forests, among the people engaged in the business of nature, aka forestry or agriculture, which would be to say, in their proper sphere. One can often search there long and in vain, but find it instead in a great factory town. One can find its member in a student's garret, where a boy, after finishing with his algebra, instead of going out to look for company in a stuffy bar, plays with and looks after his pet bullfinch, or in the basement shop of a shoemaker, who hardly knows the name of the bird that chirps for him while he's busy nailing leather. One can recognize its members in a crowd by their peculiar behavior in certain unusual circumstances of city life. And thus, when the papers come out in the evening with the latest dispatches of a war, a scandalous trial, a sensational murder, and a certain person does not pick up the newspaper, but instead studies with a smile how the sparrows settle for the night, she is of the forest folk. And from this family comes she who, amid a solemn street procession, when everyone else is absorbed in music, uniforms, caparisons, and parading ranks of soldiers in civic societies, notices a chilled pooch in front of a closed shop door and opens it for him with a gentle word of kindness. Among the classified advertisements, a member of this family will spot the address of a caged nightingale seller, ransom the prisoner, and release him from captivity with the arrival of spring, partaking in his joy of liberation. The forest folk usually keep shy from others, hide their souls, and do not talk about their inner life, aware that no one cares about it. In the monstrous mill of worldly life, where financial self-interest and the ruthless struggle for the luxuries of civilization reign, as they deal with others, with horror or utter astonishment in their eyes, they remain silent, They fulfill their social obligations and look out, only not to allow themselves to be crushed and pulverized. They do not fear for their souls. Those are safe from the world's pollution. And so, they vegetate, rare in the world and strangers to it. Occasionally they find a friend. Then the doors of the soul fling open, and the newfound friends find solace in each other. Dreams, needs, longings, all suddenly find their expression in words. As never before now, they suddenly give voice to their lust for freedom, for quiet, for communion with nature. They express their souls and strive to turn those longings into action, for life after their own hearts. And precisely that kind of life, a whole summer of it, will be our topic here. For those who had lived it, it will be a chronicle of happiness. For those who, in their worldly exile, only dream of it, a brotherly postcard, and perhaps a call to action. There were 3 of them. The oldest, their chief and commander, was cunning, stubborn in his resolve, quick to decide, knowledgeable about nature's science, and experienced in living with it. He owned a vast stretch of land, some 3,000 acres, and on it, agricultural land with a manor house, the nerve center of his agricultural enterprise. All around it lay various marshes and forests, cut by a network of slow meandering streams and rivulets, set well off from public roads and wholly unappetizing to human greed. There, in the depths of those unproductive marshlands, hidden like a secret lair, a forester's cabin came into existence one spring. For some time afterward, the shingle roof and sideboards shone white in the sun, and the deep ruts in the ground shone black, where the carts had brought the building materials. But within a year, all that newness was buried in the greenery of grass and moss. Wild rose and heather covered the walls, and the cabin melted into the surrounding landscape. The forest folk called it their refuge. Life had robbed the chief of relatives. He had no family. But his house was full of God's creatures, who remained in the manor house under the care and protection of his companion, a friend whom he had trained and shaped after his own image. In their joking jargon, they called the chief Wolverine and his friend Panther. Panther was the youngest, all made of steely muscle, swift, agile, and with his namesake's wildness and rapacity. He knew nature from living with it. He understood mountains, waters, meadows. He had a forest soul through and through. Later, a third one joined them, whom they called Crane. He had the purest soul of them all, the embodiment of kindness, gentleness, and inward sunny happiness. He rejoiced in the life of the forest as only youth can rejoice. He was a dreamer, a little absent-minded, quick to laugh, industrious, and of both iron health and constitution. The 3 complemented each other and became regular summertime residents in that refuge of theirs, the founders and builders of that life. There, they lived at one with the wilderness, like every other creature that arrived there in spring and flew away in autumn. Their refuge, locked up for the winter, fell asleep at the end of summer. First, the roof was buried under golden leaves, then under snow, and then only animals drew their tracks about it. Tits and squirrels wintered under its eaves. Hares came to feed in the feeders, and snakes buried themselves to hibernate under the foundations. Finches came to feed on the frozen berries, and from time to time, deer approached to nibble on the dried-up flowers planted there by Crane. Meanwhile, far away, among the maddening crowd, the forest folk remembered their cabin and dreamed of tits and finches and the rest of their summer friends, and awaited springtime. Early spring. Wolverine and Crane wintered in the city. Panther remained near the forest, looking after Wolverine's manor house, some 15 miles away from their refuge. The three rarely exchanged news, like birds that do not sing in winter but only greet each other from time to time with the expressive pain, pain, pain. Therefore, when, near the end of February, Wolverine saw an envelope addressed to him in a spindly scrawl, he said only, "Spring must be early this year. Larks are surely singing if Panther writes." They opened the letter and read it eagerly, looking over each other's shoulders, their eyes shining with joy. "Forest greetings to Chief and friend. I report that yesterday our friend Stomper woke up. He had gone to sleep so fat that he barely fit into your boot. But yesterday he emerged so thin that the boot shank fanned about him like a broad foyer. He promptly clambered into my lap, pricked me, and snorted, 'Food!' He then swallowed a mountain of cheese and a river of milk, swelled up hugely, and is now running about the house, terrorizing the mice. Thus, spring must be near. But Jake does not agree. Last October, on top of the ceramic stove, Jake made himself a nest out of several rags, my winter gloves, your cook's bonnet, and several branches of oleander. When the whole thing reached up to the ceiling, he crawled in it, closed it behind him, and went to sleep. He, too, woke up yesterday. The sleep had served him well. His fur is silver, shiny, his tail bushy like an ostrich feather, and his ear tufts are very rakish. He crawled out, stretched, drank some water, ate a few nuts, and went out to investigate. He did not investigate long. He returned angry, his tail wet, his paws dirty, and he spat out the buds he had picked, making it clear that they were bitter, 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 and that it was way too early, and time to sleep some more. And that better times were surely still a long way away. He announced as much from the top of the stove and crawled into his house. And that's all we saw of him. Blue Tit, who had also wintered indoors, hunting moths and moth eggs, also insisted on being let out. Well and good, I opened the window and out she went, like to a wedding with a swing. She now peels worms off the maple tree by the window and chirps at me, "It's time, it's time!" And whom is one to believe? Because the larks, you know, are back too. And how? I went to say hello to them, far out in the field. In depressions, snow still lies and ice holds, but the glades are bare and blackened by molehills. The wind is like mint. It seems cold, yet it burns. And lark song is in full possession of our fields, and will stay so till winter. And now for the news about the travelers. The first greylags came to rest overnight last Friday and raised a great hubbub. I went to hear what news they had brought from overseas. The night was clear and echoing with silence, still frosty. The edges of the ponds covered themselves with ice and stayed that way till noon. Every night, crowds of traveling birds fall onto our black orchard. They fall, say hardly a word, and are off again at dawn. These will not spend the summer with us. These regiments have a destination farther north. I have 3 pairs of partridges in the attic. I found them in traps set up by boys in the winter, and they ask me every morning how many more days of imprisonment are left of their sentence. Sparrows are about it too, betrothals in full swing, like at a church fair. They all swear that spring is just around the corner. But bees are like Jake. I knocked on some of the hives and asked, "Queen Mother, is it spring?" But they grunted sleepily, "Psst, psst, Mother is asleep." Whom to believe, then? And how to remain patient? It's not spring, yet. And yet, it is no more the witch winter. It's not the summer's army, but it is its vanguard, announcing, "Time to get ready." So, the more impatient are doing just that. The flowers of the carmine hazel are still covered by husks against the cold, but she has already let out her catkins to the wind. Kingcups have been swelling at the bottom of icy waters, and anemones are slinking about under the leaves on the ground. Everything is ready. And when you put your ear to the ground, you can hear that something is afoot, something a person cannot understand. Is it the earth and its music? Or is it one's own heart? It's all one thing. They all cry, life, life, life. I'll wait a tad longer, and when everything cries out like this, I will call you, saying, "It is time." Meanwhile, I make clogs, fiddle with the canoe, and fix all pots and baskets, and I wait, trembling with excitement. Such was the letter. Wolverine looked it over once more. "The earthworms haven't stirred," he said. "The witch will be back." They both sighed. A longing twisted a knife in their hearts. Crane said, "I felt the color, the smell, the taste, the music. How it hurts to wait. Let's sneak out beyond the city limits. Listen and see. Let's drink the wind." "Let's," replied Wolverine, "for we still have yet long to wait. Until the solstice is another 7 weeks. The solstice. In March, Witch Winter returned once more. She sent her troops, gray regiments of clouds and packs of northern winds, and hurled this army on the swollen trees, the creeping leaves, the multitudes of birds, all these creatures that had dared her with their wedding song. From these evil clouds there now fell on all this starting life deadly droves of snow amidst the howling of the wind. The sun, pale like a ghost, remained behind this cluster of clouds, patient and confident in its rising strength, and certain of its eventual triumph. Like a powerful, confident man, the sun allowed the enemy a few moments to vent, spend all her strength, and exhaust herself, so that he might then shine his light and triumph. "Poor Blue Tit," said Crane, looking at the clouds of snow. "Ha! Blue Tit probably knocked on the window during the first snowstorm and asked to be let back in," replied Wolverine. "It's worse for the critters in the forest. If the waters are up, Panther cannot take food to them. And if the witch calls for frost to support..." "Trees are full of sap, and their branches are swollen. They ache when touched. We have to come to their aid." The two rushed beyond city limits, found a wood weighted with heavy snow, and began to shake off the white shrouds. They recognized the trees and spoke to them as if to closest friends. "Grow your beautiful corals, you mountain ash. Blow in the wind, you silver birch. Sway soft, soft, you fragile maple. This snow is too heavy even for you, dear spruce, you winter hero." Tree branches flexed with relief, liberated. They laughed and warmed up, overjoyed and intoxicated by the March air. Only twilight put an end to their work, and at night it happened, just as Wolverine had feared. Frost Killer squeezed his claws into murderous fists. Woods groaned with the pain of burst tissue, broken limbs fell on the snow. The witch cackled with delight at the loss of young life. "Why is all this?" Crane whispered. "Why, it's the law," Wolverine replied. "A law beyond our understanding. The law. But this is not death, not real death. It is a small death, a tiny and weak death. Without wind and thunder, she is like without fangs, naked as an earthworm. When a true catastrophe comes, no forest survives in her wake. No powerful animal survives, no speedy bird. All that's left is death." For 3 days, the evil frost tormented the earth. For 3 nights, winds blew, wrestling and struggling with each other in clouds of snow dust, howling, hissing, growling, groaning, until one morning, on the new moon of the new month, a wave of air came suddenly from the south, the main army of spring. The snow clouds fled before her like a wicked lot, and the victorious sun rose in the radiant blue. The air brought his strong, living power, the power of health, and it swarmed the earth, swirled, drowned, and played the hymn of rebirth. Now, to the forest folk, a different message came from Panther, a short shout of a panting runner. "The forest is alive! He sings! He calls! Come!" They jumped up and began to pack feverishly, overwhelmed with panic, need, drive, lust in their souls like migratory birds. Something in them called out, deafening all else. To life! To life! To refuge! To refuge! To refuge! To refuge. There was hustle and bustle at daybreak in front of Wolverine's manor house. The morning was April all over, clear, sunny, damp, with the rain that had passed through the previous night. Passed, causing miracles. It peeled the sticky shells off leaves, washed away the rest of the autumn mold from grasses, opened the eyes of white anemones and violets, lured the gold of marigolds out of waters, washed willows and sallows, and covered them with suddenly conjured catkins. In the silence of the night, the rain had woken them with its murmur, inviting them to a wedding. And when the sun rose, the earth turned toward him, fragrant, colorful, and seemingly singing with joy. A long wagon now stood in front of the porch. It was being loaded with everything that was or could be needed during the summer. Crane packed food, spices, medicines, a handy first aid kit. Panther, provisions for companion animals, nets, pots, baskets, clogs, craft tools. And Wolverine, his boxes, manuals, and measuring rods, the bulk of nature research. All were so absorbed in their work that they drifted from home to the cart like bees, loading and loading, and the cart was piling up. "And now only room enough for men," said Wolverine, examining the cart. "If you have forgotten anything, you shall have to do without." "Oh, yes, I am sure I forgot something," Crane worried and groaned. And now, the feeder of the forest folk entered through the gate. The bay piebald Hathor, who had summered with them in the wood for years. She was skin and bones after the hard winter, her hair spiky and dull. The animal knew what all this loading meant. She went to Panther, sniffed his hands, got bread and salt, looked at the cart, nibbled on the hay, checked to see for the smell of potatoes and chaff, rubbed her neck on the wheel guard, and stood, looking at them with her gentle eyes, chewing slowly. "Hathor, you want your bam-bam?" asked Panther, bringing out of the house a tin cow rattle on a thong. Hathor moved her ears negatively and reluctantly turned her horned head. No, Hathor didn't want her bam-bam. A few years ago, when she had first been fitted with this rattling horror, she became mad with fear and disgust and exhausted herself trying to get rid of the thing, plowing through thickets in the hope of tearing it off. In this irritation, she had committed a criminal act. She had swung her horns at Panther, roaring grimly, "Murder! Murder!" But that was a long time ago, at the very beginning of her forest service. Since then, Hathor came to understand that putting on Bam-Bam meant the coming of the blissful life in the wilderness and the abundance of pasture and water, and of unlimited freedom. There would be no cowherd and no stick, no dogs, no chain in the stuffy barn, no treacherous horns of envious companions. Hathor had lost her herd instinct over the years, and, Led out of the barn, she did not so much as grunt a single word of goodbye to her winter companions. Without enthusiasm, but also without protest, she allowed herself to be fitted with Bam Bam. "Panther, harness up Patch Pelt. I'm going to fetch our householders. You take the birdcage, Crane," commanded Wolverine, entering the house. Crane now placed on the cart a large basket covered with a colorfully embroidered napkin. Panther and Hathor breathed the scent with delight. They smelled fresh rye bread. "The chief is such a driver today that breakfast somehow went missing," said Panther. "I can't resist it when it smells like this." He reached for a knife in his belt, lifted the napkin, made a sign of the cross over the loaf, and sliced off a hunk. He broke it, and they all shared it. Hathor's wet mouth slipped in among them for company. "Ah, right! Chief ordered harness," Panther remembered, turning to the stable. Soon, a piebald mare came out into the sunny yard, treading cautiously. She pulled Panther down to the well, drank her fill, and then went up to the wagon of her own accord. She tasted the hay, searched the muzzle bag for chaff, snorted, yawned, stretched, and, with resignation, gave her head to the collar. "Do not complain about the load," said Panther. "We know you're with a foal. When we come to mud and sand, we will jump off and go on foot. Now, come on in the thill." He pulled the straps on, harnessed her, and stood ready for the journey, sharing his bread with the beasts. "Crane, tell the chief that all is ready. The way is long. We'll barely make it for supper." Meanwhile, in the manor, Wolverine struggled with the householders. Stomper, a hedgehog, and Jake, a squirrel, were the height of contradictions of customs and preferences. They knew little of each other, but enough to hate each other, if only because neither would let the other sleep. During the night, Stomper frightened Jake with his incessant tramping. The squirrel stuck out his head from his nest and cursed, "You filthy crawler, centipede eater, slipper sleeper, may you choke on a frog. Your stomping prevents us from sleeping." And during the daytime, while rummaging around, Jake would peer over the armrest of the couch and, trying to stash away a few nuts, drop them on the sleeping Stomper, who wiggled and hooted furiously. "You brawler, you mischief maker, you jester, clown, scarecrow, bird's laughing stock. May tree resin stick your tail to your nose. May your mouth never close on your teeth." This quarreling lasted all winter. If the two had anything in common, it was their hatred for Mrs. Barker. She actually lived in a stable, but sometimes came into the manor house, sniffing everywhere, upsetting everything, noisy and annoying beyond all expression. She was true poison. Although Jake was safe at the top of the stove, the very appearance of Mrs. Barker gave him palpitations, and he held his hands dramatically to his puffed-up chest. Stomper, under his couch, suffered from liver attacks and asthma. Today, taking advantage of the turmoil of the trip, Mrs. Barker slipped into the house, causing terrible panic. She chased Jake onto the wardrobe, barking threats and impertinence at him until she ran out of breath. She then sniffed Stomper in Panther's old boot, and, unable to get to him, dragged that boot all around the room. At this, Wolverine arrived, grabbed her by the neck, and unceremoniously threw her out of the house. But by then, all the householders were in total rebellion. Stomper was so angry that he jumped up and down in the boot and snorted, "That's it! That's it! I don't want you! I don't want to go to the forest! Don't touch me! Get away, away, you wicked false friends! That servant of yours wanted to eat me. In fact, she may have eaten me for all I know. I can't even tell, I'm so upset."
"No way am I coming down either,"
Jake squawked from the height of his perch, his little hand pressed to his heart.
"I'm not stupid. I am not leaving here. No way. Nobody in my entire clan has ever heard so many insults as I did today from that evil creature. You've got to make up your mind. It's either her or me. And no, whatever it is that you are holding in your hand is not going to change my mind, even sunflower seeds. I have my pride. You have abandoned me to the beast. What? Am I to take that sort of abuse?"
"Very well," said Wolverine. Suit yourself. And, putting a handful of nuts back in his pocket, picked up the boot with Stomper. Stomper, that beast is not coming to the forest with us. You will play to your heart's content there. Remember how many greasy worms there are? And how soft the moss to sleep in? And in the hut, how much milk and cheese and fish livers you can have any time you want? Get out of that boot. Are you not ashamed to be carried around in that like some sort of troglodyte?
But I happen to want to sleep in this boot,
snorted Stomper and froze. Well, Jake, are you staying behind? Because I'm in a hurry. Goodbye then, the window is open.
What do you have in that pocket? Show me.
Jake jumped down on Wolverine's head and slipped into his pocket. There was a crack of the walnut shell and a soft purr of satisfaction. Peace had been made.
Ready?
Crane stuck his head through the door.
Grab your fiddle and off we go.
Off we go, commanded Wolverine, sticking the boot with Stomper among other packs and jumping onto the wagon. Crane held onto his crates. Panther jumped onto the thill. The mare snorted eagerly. Hathor swayed, and the caravan started. They went through the gate, onto the dirt road, bumpy and muddy, and looked at the bluish line of forest far away. The breath of the open spaces enveloped them now, relaxed their lungs, brought color to their faces, and lit their longing pupils with the fire of joy. The anthem! The anthem, Chief! Panther reminded them. And Wolverine sang to the blues of forests and fields. It's time to go, it's time to go, you commander of our armies. Here's the oaken wreath for your helm, the rosemary club for your hand, your golden arrowhead. You will lead us, on to our golden trail, where hearts and songs have time to bloom, where dormant forests quiet wait, and the eagle's silent flight. You'll take the world in your triumphant march, where out of ashes new flowers bloom, where dawn breaks out from the jail of night, the battle of our lives. The settlement. They passed fields, human settlements, crossroads, and golden marigold meadows, and headed on towards the wood. The trail became more and more indistinct, and the forest turned gradually from a distant smudge into a dark, massive wall. Until, like the advance party, old pines suddenly burst onto their path just as they came over the edge of a hill. Behind them stood a solid wall of trees, lined with juniper and heather. They were greeted by a gentle and solemn hum, like a prayer, carrying with it the incense smell of resin. They were about to enter the sacred temple of the forest. They took their hats off and looked up, their lips moving in silent greeting. No one spoke. They listened intently. The mare led the way. Without thinking, she picked out cracks in the forest wall, a barely visible path. She did not hesitate at turns or in the narrow passages among wetlands. She found footbridges thrown across treacherous dikes. She wheeled and wove, so sure of her memory that she picked at snacks along the way. Now a bunch of rush, now a twig of birch, and she chewed on them for fun. The ground descended slowly. They rode over ancient levees made of oak logs centuries ago, where maybe once Swedish or Cossack armies had passed. They moved along the edges of great peat bogs, cleared a trail through marshes, and got stuck from time to time in the thickets of reed and rush. The sun was in their eyes, at their backs, to their left, to their right, and finally, the only trail to be seen was the one they made, as clear as a path trodden by an elk. Then water flashed among the thicket, a stream spilled into a wide ford, disappearing in sallow beds. They had reached the boundary of their summer kingdom.
"Here is our rainbow bridge,"
said Crane. All three gave a shout, the usual cord with which they called each other when separated during their expeditions. The mare entered the ford eagerly, bowed her head, stroked the water with her lips, looking for the deepest reach, then stood and began to drink. Hathor followed suit, and the men drew water into their hands. "Let us drink of Lethe's stream, forget the other world," said Wolverine. "It's as delicious as birch sap, like wine," said Panther.
"And it's full of fry. Look, there, against the sand at the bottom. Can you see?" Crane pointed out. "Oh, and a green-headed drake is there. Can you see under those trees?"
The beasts of burden, their thirst slaked, raised their heads and opened their muzzles. The mare neighed, and Hathor tugged at her rope. Both sensed their summer pastures. Even Jake, sitting on Wolverine's shoulder, measured the distance to the first clump of birch, and, as soon as they cleared the ford, gave a leap and was gone in the treetops. The men jumped off. Hathor was released. Wolverine took a cage with the partridges and the basket with the hare, animals that had wintered with Panther on the farm. Let go, the hare was in no hurry to run. He stood on his hinds, scented, raised his flaps, glanced at the men, and slowly hopped off into the heather. The partridges, like yellow balls, rolled in single file behind him. "Do not curse us, you godly martyrs. We are innocent of your misfortunes," whispered Wolverine. When he returned to the wagon, he was alone. His comrades, carried away by the sudden frenzy of freedom, had rushed ahead on foot. Jake accompanied them along the treetops, and the mare pulled on her own in the direction she knew so well. Wolverine caught up with her and walked alongside, steering her from time to time so that the cart would not catch on trees. But he, too, was busy with his thoughts. He read the story of his country's winter. Here, he knew every tree, every foot of earth, and he welcomed it all like his dearest friends. The forest had kept no secrets from him. It told, showed, bragged, and complained. Here was the old pine tree with the killer sparrowhawk's nest, and there another, bent and limp, which had once been broken in her youth. Here was a birch with a monstrous burl and an enormous rowan, which they called the Stunner, and that had so many corals in autumn and a hornbeam split in half by lightning that had survived the blow but shone with the black streak of the old wound. And there a birch felled by frozen sleet, and a squat willow with an old squirrel hole where wild bees had already moved in. And there was the huge anthill, already crawling with life, the great empire of black forest workers, strewn with white lumps of resin and traces of winter raids by black grouse. And here was an alder ditch full of holes, fissures, chasms, roots, torn half out of the ground by a storm, a hideout for snakes and vipers. The forest whispered softly, a kind of quiet panting of the revival of spring. And the man, staring and listening, lost himself in this great, mighty whole, and felt how great its forces entered him, and how he absorbed their power, how they now coursed inside him. Beyond the ford, the ground rose. Their refuge was like an elevated island amid the bogs, surrounded on all sides by peat and swamp crisscrossed by small rivers and overgrown with impenetrable thicket. On this miraculously fertile island, a forest stood in a full riot. Birch trees darted towards the sun, swaying their green gauze-like slender dancers. Lovely hornbeams bloomed, stocky like virile farmhands. Alders, ashes, oaks, lindens, rowan trees, maples all pressed together and upwards towards the sky. And lower down, hazel, viburnum, bird cherry, buckthorn. At their feet, raspberries and blackberries covered the ground. The clearings in the forest were white with anemones, and tall grass fluttered like the ready background for a tapestry yet to be woven by the coming summer. The lingering cries of his companions woke Wolverine from his reverie. He glanced at the sun, then lightly nudged the feeding mare. Home to the cabin, Patch Pelt. We also deserve dinner. Ah, here comes the scout. Krr, krr, a voice said among the branches. Jake fell onto his shoulder, rubbed his tail on his cheek, and dove into his pocket for nuts. They went on, to the left, then to the right, under the braids of birch trees, through wreaths and arches of bird cherry, until a large oaken cross with a carved figure under its own little roof appeared. Then the forest wall parted. A wide clearing opened up, and in its center stood the cottage of the forest folk. Its walls were gilded with streaks of resin and covered by the lace of wild roses and woodbine. The hut was low, spacious, on a high fundament, but still closed for winter, secured with locked shutters. In front of it lay a garden surrounded by a fence, Crane's patio, as they called it, planted with various forest flowers, and shaded from the heat of the sun by a linden tree. Panther and Crane were waiting for him at the gate, and soon began their report.
A blackbird has a nest in the vine next to the wall. A bush robin moved into the box on the linden tree. Lilies of the valley are peeking out. I found a viper on the porch. We're hungry.
Wolverine was silent. He untied the mare and hung the harness on a peg under the roof. Only then did he take out the key and open the hut. The cold winter air blew over them, out of the interior. They entered the main room. The sun followed, gilding the holy icon of the Virgin Mary on the wall directly in front of them. They bared their heads, and Wolverine greeted the Queen of Poland with prayer and bow. Salve Regina Mater, misericordiae, vitae dulcedo et spes nostra. And 3 voices joined together. Salve. Then Wolverine lit the lamp in front of the icon. Crane placed a loaf of bread on the table. Panther took down the bars and opened the shutters. Spring blew its color and warmth into the room. Ah, the house didn't fail to house winter residents, they laughed. In one corner, forest mice had built a sheaf-sized nest on the bench, and an anthill had materialized under it at the opposite end. The intruders had to be turned out. Crane began to cook a meal. Smoke blew out of the chimney. The cottage came to life. Jake sat at the open window and watched the work. He had upturned his plume over his head and, feigning hunger, gnawed on a pine cone, spitting out bits on the folk crawling under the benches. But because they were too busy to pay any attention, he turned to bother Crane. And he, having set the pots in the kitchen, started to unpack the cart and carried sacks and bags, pots and boxes to the pantry. Jake liked it. He sniffed and tasted everything, and finally discovered a box of sunflower seeds and began to nibble without ceremony.
Don't ruin it!
Crane took it away. Jake was indignant.
Mine,
he croaked.
Yours, but not now. You're too fat, you glutton. Mine, give it here, protested Jake. I will not, you greedy glutton.
Crane became impatient. Then there was a brouhaha and ballyhoo, and suddenly Jake flew out of the pantry. Disheveled, his plume erect, he climbed to the top of the linden tree and screeched and screamed from there. "What happened? Where's the harm?" asked Wolverine.
Harm, exactly, Crane replied. He bit through 3 bags, bit open a box, bit my ear, and now he's screaming for help. Now you all finish up because the gruel is ready.
And my stomach, too, Panther said, rising up. We swept the swarm away. The rest can wait. Eat. First the beasts, Wolverine reminded him. True, said Panther, and bustled about. He dove into the pantry, then into the hall, and took out 2 buckets, one of potatoes, the other of oats, and set them in front of the gate. Then he took the trumpet off the wall in the room and sounded the bugle call. The sound slapped the silence, flew into the forest, shattered the air. The signal was well known because it was answered immediately by a neigh and the distant sound of Hathor's clapper. Leaning against the forest fence, Panther waited. The mare was the first to show up. She snorted with delight and buried her head in the oats. Hathor stoically approached. Panther crouched by her side with the milking stool. "Here's asking kindly for the milk, Hathor, and don't hold back, because we're exhausted and ready to eat." He spoke to her gently.
"Lunch on the table!"
cried Crane from the room. On the white maple table, under the paintings, lay a loaf of bread, a beautifully painted, steaming clay bowl, and 3 wooden spoons. Crane had even decorated the table with a wreath of marigolds. They took their places on the benches and dipped in deep, like honestly hungry folk. Jake assisted, trying each slice of bread, then wiped his mouth on Wolverine's sleeve with disgust, jumped onto the windowsill, and started his midday nap. "Humans eat disgusting things," he thought with a grimace, closing his eyes. When the spoons scraped the bottom of the bowl, Wolverine said, "I'm going to take the boat, check on the fish, and set the traps. Panther will inspect and ready the stable, and Crane will clean the rest of the cottage and check the vegetable garden. Tomorrow, we will hoe and plant." "First of all, I'd like to change my hide," said Panther, inspecting his clothes. "Well then, you two go change and I'll smoke a pipe. And we need the clogs, too." The bedroom was behind the hall, wide and bright. It was where Wolverine and Crane slept at night. Panther slept in his alcove just beyond. Soon they were completely changed. They wore their forest uniform. Gray linen outfits and light linden clogs, a leather belt with a knife in a sheath attached to the loose jacket, and a felt hat on the head. "Now the forest will recognize us as its own." Panther laughed with delight, and, taking an axe, went to work in the stables. Crane started to wash the pots. And now it was time for Wolverine to get going. He straightened his limbs with delight, changed his clothes, and unloaded his personal box, full of zoological books, collections and scientific instruments, and thousands of other small items he used for his studies and guarded as a treasure. Then he hung the old sheepskin sleeve high under the ceiling, Jake's nest, and put the boot with Stomper in its corner. He finally loaded himself with fish baskets, took an oar and an axe, and went to find the boat. It had its place beyond the spring, under the old alder, by the stream. Wolverine bailed out the rainwater, loaded the baskets, unhooked the bast strap, and pushed off. The expanse before him was endless, because the bogs were still flooded with spring meltwater. One could paddle in every direction, among the beds of the barely green and young shoots of the rushes. On the water lay spring duckweed, the favorite spring snack of Hathor and Patch Pelt, and he soon found them up to their bellies in the water, feeding. They raised their heads and talked in the forest tongue. "Good, wholesome," snorted Patch Pelt. "A bit watery," muttered Hathor. He patted each of them as he passed, and said, "Just you remember not to go to the deep end beyond the spring, where you nearly drowned last summer. Both you and we nearly died. Remember, you gluttons." Swarms of marsh birds raved over the shallow water. Lapwings, curlews, and snipes screamed like at a wedding. Golden marsh sallows smelled of honey. Birch and alder smelt of balsam. The oar scooped up golden marigolds and clumps of water mint. And the sun, working its miracles, laughed to see its work. Wolverine paddled up to the water fence, checked the depth, tied the canoe to a stake, and slipped into the water. He inspected the whole length of the fence, mended gaps with twigs, and, at the inlet where the current ran, he placed the basket. He worked slowly, methodically, observing all the rules of the fisherman's craft, guessing how the fish might go based on various minute observations, engrossed in his work, and all the time ospreys wheeled over his head. The forest folk knew the rules of communing with nature. They avoided sudden movements, noise, frightening and scaring. They kept a shotgun in the cottage for emergencies, but that hardly ever came, at most as a measure against some predator. Beasts and birds had fast accustomed to the sound of Hathor's knocker in their mealtime bugle, and the whole forest now knew well that no harm would come from the three. A small gray boat with a gray man inside it, churning water with the slow stirring of the oar, was now a picture completely familiar to the birds. Familiar, daily, and common. So common that the lapwings no longer bothered with their usual tricks designed to lead a potential hunter away from their nests. Flocks of teal fed carelessly along the path of the canoe. Wolverine set up a second basket and a third, paddled about various fishing waters and bays, inspected the usual hiding places of fish, renewed last year's acquaintance with his companions of forest life, and completely forgot about the time. He was just rummaging in some corner of the lake by the sandy hills to the west when, suddenly, the air burst with a polyphonic predatory cry. There was in it the blaring of ancient military horns and something like the call and answer of the scouts.
They're awake, watchmen awake! They're watchmen awake! It's twilight, it's twilight. It's time, watchmen awake!
It was the cranes, sending their evening song from their inaccessible bogs. Wolverine glanced at the sun and, obeying its signs, turned the boat back towards the cottage. The treetops were red and gold, and a silver mist rose from the water. Birds rushed with the last tidbits of food and the last blades of grass to their nests. The time had come for rest and evening prayers. "I will be late," thought Wolverine. But he did not rush because rushing would frighten the birds. The crane trumpets came 3 more times, more prolonged and more insistent each time.
Evening light, awake, watchmen, awake!
And then the bog suddenly burst in with the croak and chortle of frogs. Green-headed drakes began to splash at the edges of the water and call hoarse, luring calls. The mists thickened. The surface of the water wrinkled with the feeding fry. Up in the sky, white clouds bloomed pink like roses. A song thrush on top of alder trees began its call to prayer. Dusk was nigh. When Wolverine landed at the clearing, there was the usual bustle of the ending day. Crane, with Jake on his head, was bringing buckets of water from the spring. Panther was leading Hathor into the stable, and the mare stood in front of the gate, demanding her evening oats. "Hello, Chief. We couldn't wait." "Wait for what?" "Wait for you. Because we have a lot of news. An owl has wintered in the attic and still lives there. The attic is full of mouse fur, a furrier one would think. Probably also a lot of feathers. We shall have to ask her to leave. And the old water serpent is still in the shed. It has grown a good 2 hands. Great tits have settled in the bird boxes, and in one a wryneck. The wild pear tree is all white like a bride. And there will be plenty of hazel this summer. The hazel bush is covered with catkins. In the heathers by the vegetable patch, a black grouse sits on 6 eggs. Stomper has set out to hunt. Bees buzz in the hive." Crane stopped to rest with his buckets. Panther came out of the barn with a mug of milk. The mare came to join them for company. And so they stood in the middle of the clearing. Patch Pelt repeated one thing over and over. "Oats, oats, oats." "Stuff her mouth, will you, Panther?" Wolverine laughed. "Oh, but no one can. That's not a belly, it's a gaping abyss. Come on, you bottomless barrel." "My goodness, the water's boiling." Crane heard the fizzle of the stove and rushed into the hut. Wolverine took Sleepy Jake into his hands and slipped him into his sleeve nest under the ceiling. The doors of the stable creaked as they closed behind the mare. For a moment, one could hear the chopping of logs and the clanging of pots in the kitchen. But the sounds of work slowly faded. The twilight was diminishing in the sky. But they felt no urge to go inside and eat. Around them, the trees and bushes, beds and rushes, water and earth and heaven, began the last act of the day. The evening prayer of all creatures. At the entrance to their cottage, the forest folk sat down on an oak log, looked, listened, and fell silent. And then, quietly, Wolverine said, "Praise be to you, Lord, who made all these miracles." The sickle of the moon rose above the trees and silvered the face of the saint on the cross, who seemed as if hugged by the mist rising from below and appeared to float miraculously above the ground. The air, cooled by dew, brought the scent of honey and balsam, and the nightingale lute player began to sing on the birch tree by the spring. The frog orchestra struck their double basses. A bat circled noiselessly overhead, chasing moths. Calmed by the great silence, night descended on earth. And thus ended the first day of their forest life.